All right, I've put off making this one long enough. This is a topic that I think is historically interesting, but it's kind of tedious, but it's important. The main idea of this video is to talk about the context of Aryanism and where it comes from. And mostly I'm reacting to the statement, which I'm going to let Dan Richards tell you, but it's probably out there, that Aryan, the term Aryan, did not become kind of a loaded term or didn't have any baggage until World War II and Hitler comes along. Here's what Dan says.
It's also worth mentioning that the term Aryan was not loaded at this point, all right? The term Aryan was not a loaded term at this point. The seeds had been planted, and in a few more decades, the term would start to gain the negative connotations it has now. But really, that kind of took off because of some weird guy with a funny mustache, and he liked these angry windmills, it looks like, and stuff. He kind of made a mess of Europe in the 40s. You might know the guy, right? And that is the reason that the term Aryan is loaded nowadays. So even trying to compare it to the back in those days, it's not even close. That term was used a lot back in those days by all kinds of different people. So that's kind of absurd.
All right, I don't know where he got that idea, but it is just not historically accurate. So we're going to get into this, and I'm going to do the best that I can to lay out an outline of where Aryanism comes from, this idea that Aryans are the master race, the best race, the innovative race, the race that originates civilization around the globe. Where did that come from? Because it did not originate with Hitler. It did not originate with Ignatius Donnelly either. It came before that. And I showed in a previous video that Donnelly was drawing on some of the source materials that were around at the time when Aryanism was becoming a more popular concept in Europe. He cited some of those guys, but it's worth, I think, taking a minute or two, or however long it takes, to try to muddle my way through this and share with you what I have learned in my exploration of where Aryanism comes from, because it was not invented in the 1930s by the Nazis. Muddle. As long as we're all playing in the big old sandbox of Atlantis and the history of thoughts on Atlantis and the idea of a Aryan super civilization during the Ice Age, this is all part of that. So the term Aryan is, let's see, I'm gonna cheat and read from Wikipedia. Aryan, or Arya in Proto-Indo-Iranian, is a term originating from the ethnocultural self-designation of the Indo-Iranians and later Iranians and Indo-Aryans. What language does it come from? Endonym, and in reference to a region called Aryavarta, which is Sanskrit, land of the Aryans, where their culture emerged. So Aryan was a term used by Indo-Iranian peoples to reference themselves. We are Aryans. It first enters the English language in the late 1700s. And again, I'm still on Wikipedia here. The term Arya was first rendered into a modern European language in 1771 as Aryans by French Indologist Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil Duparron, who rightly compared the Greek Arioi, don't know how to pronounce that, with the Avestan Arya and the country name Iran. The Sanskrit word Arya is rendered as noble in William Jones's 1794 translation of the Indian Laws of Manu, and the English Aryan, originally spelt Arian, appeared a few decades later, first as an adjective in 1839 and then as a noun in 1851. So the word comes out of people studying the Indo-Iranian languages, and it's a Sanskrit word. It's translated as noble. So this is in the late 1700s, early 1800s. I'm going to use a chart that I will put back on when I need to plot things on it so we can see these relationships in time. It's useful. So here in the late 1700s, we have the word Aryan entering the English language as kind of a self-referential term, a self-identifier for an ethnic group. Fine. We're going to put that in green down here in the corner. That's where it starts. That's where it comes in. So in 1813, a man called Thomas Young is the first person to introduce the term Indo-European, relating European languages to Sanskrit. In other words, I don't know whether he was the first to recognize that they were related, but he was the first to group them into a language family, at least the first that I've found. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know I have a lot of viewers out there who love to correct me when I'm wrong, so have at it. This is not something that I know. This is something that I have tried to learn in order to fill in this chain here. It's not really a chain. It's more of a bunch of braided, sinewy strands that cross each other. Anyway, 1813, Thomas Young introduces the term Indo-European, relating the European languages to Sanskrit. Here's a look at Thomas Young. So 1773 to 1829. So he died in his late 50s, 56. So that's an 1822 portrait of him. So he's about the same age as I am there. Is it just me, or when you look at these historical portraits of people, you're like, man, 50 used to be, it's like 70 is the new 50. I mean, the guy, okay. Hope I live longer than Thomas Young. Okay. He has been described as the last man who knew everything. Well, that's a pretty nice title. Moving on. We got Aryans to get to. We got to go quickly here. The major guy in the story of Aryans and Aryanism is Max Mueller. I believe that's how you would pronounce that. If there's any foreign language that I can competently speak, though you might not guess it from my YouTube channel, but it's French, so I don't really get, I think the little umlaut on the U there is a Mueller, so Max Mueller. 1823 to 1900. German-born British comparative philologist and Orientalist, one of the founders of the Western academic disciplines of Indonology and religious studies. So he studied India extensively. All right, let's have a look at what Mueller did with the Sanskrit and the Aryans. Mueller's Sanskrit studies came at a time when scholars had started to see language development in relation to cultural development. The recent discovery of the Indo-European language group, which would be by Thomas Young, the last man alive who knew everything, had started to lead to much speculation about the relationships between Greco-Roman cultures and those of more ancient peoples. In particular, the Vedic culture of India was thought to have been the ancestor of European classical cultures. Scholars sought to compare the genetically related European and Asian languages to reconstruct the earliest form of the root language. The Vedic language Sanskrit was thought to be the oldest of the Indo-European languages. Okay, Wikipedia entry on Max Mueller still. Aryanism. Mueller's work contributed to the developing interest in Aryan culture, which often set Indo-European, quote, Aryan traditions in opposition to Semitic religions. He was deeply saddened by the fact that these classifications later came to be expressed in racist terms, as this was far from his intention. There's a citation for that quote. For Mueller, the discovery of common Indian and European ancestry was a powerful argument against racism, arguing that an ethnologist who speaks of Aryan race, Aryan blood, Aryan eyes and hair is as great a sinner as a linguist who speaks of a dolichocephalic dictionary or a brachycephalic grammar. He's referring to the people who were into studying skull shape at that point, and that the blackest Hindus represent an earlier stage of Aryan speech and thought than the fairest Scandinavians. So my understanding of Mueller is that he did speak in terms of an Aryan race as well as an Aryan language, but it wasn't in terms that made it clear that there was a hierarchy of different races. But he did tangle those things together, and this was pretty common in what was going on in anthropology and archaeology in those days, and both of these were new disciplines. The modern conception that we have that language is separate from biology, which is separate from culture, was not there. It's a simple way to put it at that point. At least it wasn't kind of a universal. These things were still being worked out. So there were a lot of people that would conflate those, and some with, one could say, sinister purposes in mind, and some because these things were just not kind of well understood or well worked through at that point. So I believe he was the originator of the Aryan invasion theory. In the 16th century, European visitors to India became aware of similarities between Indian and European languages, and as early as 1653, Van Boxhorn had published a proposal for a proto-language. Okay, so it goes back beyond the early 1700s. Here's somebody in 1767 demonstrating the existing analogy between Sanskrit and European languages. In the 1850s, Max Mueller introduced the notion of two Aryan races, a Western and an Eastern one, who migrated from the Caucasus into Europe and India respectively. Mueller dichotomized the two groups, ascribing greater prominence and value to the Western branch. Nevertheless, this Eastern branch of the Aryan race was more powerful than the indigenous Eastern natives who were easy to conquer. So he's explaining, I think, and again, I'm probably way oversimplifying this. This is my quick hot take Wikipedia understanding, that he was trying to explain the biogeographical or the patterns of human variability in the Indian subcontinent, with having lighter skinned people and darker skinned people, by saying that the Aryans had come in and had conquered some of the darker skinned people and perhaps pushed them out. And that's the Aryan invasion theory. And that explains the Aryan languages in India that were not indigenous, but were the result of parts of that subcontinent being conquered by Aryan peoples. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that comes from Max Mueller. So he does have race and language tied up in there a little bit. So on the chart, I would have him straddling this line here. All right, next up in the mid-1800s, we have Joseph Arthur de Gobineau. How's that? How's that pronunciation? Probably not very good. 1816 to 1882, French aristocrat who is best known for helping introduce scientific race theory and racial demography, and for developing the theory of the Aryan master race and Nordicism. His most famous publication related to all this stuff, anyway, is an essay on the inequality of the human races, and I quoted from that in my first video when I was talking about Aryanism, and de Gobineau was firmly on Team Aryan, naming them the best of all the races and the whitest of the white of all the white peoples. So here's a quote from de Gobineau. Such is the lesson of history. It shows us that all civilizations derive from the white race, that none can exist without its help, and that a society is great and brilliant only so far as it preserves the blood of the noble group that created it. And you get the idea. There's no ambiguity in this guy in terms of what he thinks of Aryans versus everybody else. Unabashed white supremacist. Says right here, he was praised by other white supremacists like Josiah Nott, who was a defender of slavery in the United States. And I think, so Nott actually translated his book into English. And this is interesting because the essay on the inequality of the human races actually has 4 volumes. I've only been able to find one translated into English. So the other 3 are available in French, and they actually talk about some things that are directly relevant to this idea that white people and Aryans founded all of these civilizations around the world. And I don't know that stuff has been talked about. Yeah, he's also about the same age as me there. I think I'm aging better than all of these guys. But nobody's ever going to refer to me as the last person who knew everything. That wouldn't be accurate. His adolescence, don't care, international politics, marriage. He always regarded his book, Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines, Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, as his masterpiece and wanted to be remembered as its author. Well, he is. I think that's why people remember him. That's the only context I've ever heard of him in. A firm reactionary who believed in the innate superiority of aristocrats over commoners, whom he held in utter contempt, Gobineau embraced the now discredited doctrine of scientific racism to justify aristocratic rule over racially inferior commoners. Anyway, so there's your boy, Arthur de Gobineau. So that would have been in the 1850s. So I think we can very clearly put him in this part of, I don't know if he does talk about language. So he includes the Aryan languages. The Aryan languages, by the way, according to him, are also superior to all the other languages. So he's a linguistic superiority person too, as well as a racial superiority person. And he was thinking about them as a race, and he was definitely over here in the hierarchical side of the chart. He was ranking the races, and the Aryans were at the very top, very top. In my video, I talked about Donnelly quoting Francois Lenormand. He's quoting him because he believes in what he says. He's not just randomly quoting people. He's using it to support an argument, to make an argument. Lenormand also pretty clear white supremacist, not a lot of ambiguity there. He writes that the white race has a marked superiority over all others. In the nations of this race, we find from remote antiquity the greatest development of civilization. But Lenormand was writing in 1879, late 1870s. And we know that Ignatius Donnelly had access to that because he quotes him at length multiple times. So I would put Lenormand also over here in the racial, I don't know whether he talks about language or not, but I would definitely have the racial part of Lenormand cross-cutting into the hierarchical stuff because that's where he is on that stuff quite clearly. And then we've got Donnelly in the 1880s. So the debate, of course, is where is he here? Is he just looking at Aryans in terms of like their linguistic stock and those interesting relationships, or is it a racial classification, or is it a hierarchical racial classification? Setting aside those questions for the moment, this is where he appears in time. After Donnelly, we get Elena Blavatsky and The Secret Doctrine. She talks about Donnelly extensively, talks a lot about Aryans and her root races, and get into this supernatural stuff. Secret Doctrine, Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy, pseudoscientific esoteric book in 2 volumes in 1888 by Helena Blavatsky. And of course, Donnelly ultimately is not responsible for what people do with his work after him, but if you're trying to place him in a historic context of what people at the time thought of him and how they used it, you look after him also, as well as the things that he was citing and referring back to. So Blavatsky talks a lot about Atlantis and Aryans, and that's a whole nother thing. But out of Theosophy eventually emerges, or at least Theosophy was a strong component of what emerges as Ariosophy, which is the area comes from Aryan. And that's like, and again, I don't know all of the historical particulars here. You got your Rudolf Steiner school and your stuff like that. And this is this supernatural Aryan stuff that eventually becomes a strong component of Nazism. The point of all of this is that it is not that Hitler and his buddies just plucked out of thin air from all of these responsible scholars who were looking at Aryan language and ethnicity and just decided to turn it into something really ugly. There's a long, continuous series of feedbacks and chains and braided streams crossing each other on thoughts of Aryanism. And you can definitely place what one would call Aryanism, the Aryan stuff with a strong supremacist component, back to the mid-1800s. To Arthur de Gobineau, which is clearly way before Ignatius Donnelly. So this claim that Aryan wasn't a loaded term at all before Hitler came along with his angry windmills, so that's nonsense. That's garbage. It's not true. Here's a fun game to play. Let's end with a quiz. So you're on the honor system for the quiz. Yeah, tell me how many you got right, how many you got wrong. Let's take 3 people. We'll take Ignatius Donnelly, Arthur de Gobineau, and Adolf Hitler. And I'm going to give you a quote. You tell me which one it is. Who said it? This is a who said it game. Are you ready? Here's your first quote.
It was not by mere chance that the first forms of civilization arose there, where the Aryan came into contact with inferior races, subjugated them, and forced them to obey his command.
Who said it? Donnelly, de Gobineau, or Hitler? All right, if you guessed Hitler, you got it right. Give yourself a point. Here's your second quote.
Of the multitude of peoples which live or have lived on the earth, 10 alone have risen to the position of complete societies. The remainder have gravitated round these more or less independently, like planets round their suns. If there is any element of life in these 10 civilizations that is not due to the impulse of the white races, any seed of death that does not come from the inferior stocks that mingled with them, then the whole theory on which this book rests is false.
Who said that? Was it Donnelly, de Gobineau, or Hitler? If you guessed de Gobineau, you got it right. Quote number 3.
Such is the lesson of history. It shows us that all civilizations derive from the white race, that none can exist without its help, and that a society is great and brilliant only so far as it preserves the blood of the noble group that created it, provided that this group itself belongs to the most illustrious branch of our species.
Who said that? Donnelly, Hitler, or de Gobineau? If you chose de Gobineau, you are right again. I am sure that you are doing great. How about this one?
And they will aid us to rehabilitate the fathers of our civilization, our blood, and our fundamental ideas, the men who lived, loved, and labored ages before the Aryans descended upon India, or the Phoenician had settled in Syria, or the Goth had reached the shores of the Baltic.
Who said that? Donnelly, Hitler, or de Gobineau? All right, that was Ignatius Donnelly. That's right, talking about our blood and our fundamental ideas and the fathers of our civilization, those Aryans. Okay, here's one for you.
Those peoples who manifest creative abilities in certain periods of their history have always been fundamentally creative. It belongs to their very nature, even though this fact may escape the eyes of the superficial observer.
Who said that? Donnelly, de Gobineau, or Adolf Hitler? That one was Hitler. Give yourself a point for Hitler. How about this one?
Civilization is not communicable to all. Many savage tribes are incapable of it. There are two great divisions of mankind, the civilized and the savage. And, as we shall show, every civilized race in the world has had something of civilization from the earliest ages. The abyss between the civilized man and the savage is simply incalculable. It represents not alone a difference in arts and methods of life, but in the mental constitution, the instincts, and the predispositions of the soul.
Who said that? Donnelly, de Gobineau, or Hitler? Give yourself a point if you got Ignatius Donnelly on that one. And that was an easy one because that's probably his most famous quote. That's hyperdiffusionism in a nutshell, so that's a pretty famous one. How about this one?
If we subject the different peoples to a strict test from this standpoint, we shall find that scarcely any one of them has originally created a culture, but almost all have been merely the recipients of a culture created elsewhere.
Donnelly, de Gobineau, or Hitler? That one's Hitler. Also, hyperdiffusionism in a nutshell. The source of culture is another civilized culture, and culture flows from superior to inferior, and that culture is, of course, the Aryans. That one's Hitler. All right, how about this one?
If we divide mankind into three categories, founders of culture, bearers of culture, and destroyers of culture, the Aryan alone can be considered as representing the first category.
Ignatius Donnelly, de Gobineau, or Hitler? That one's also Hitler. Boy, Hitler and those Aryans. Okay, I hope you did well on the quiz. The point of that is it's not so easy, I think. You know, Donnelly didn't write with the same kind of in-your-face white supremacy as de Gobineau or Hitler. But I feel like you got to put him over there on the racial hierarchy side. You know, he's certainly not talking about Aryan stuff just as a language or just as a self-referential ethnic term. He's talking about it in racial terms, and he's talking about it in racial terms with a component of the superiority of culture and hyperdiffusionism and that sort of thing. But anyway, the claim that there couldn't be any kind of Aryan superiority, Aryanism stuff going on in Donnelly's Atlantis because that stuff postdates Donnelly is nonsense. It most surely predates Donnelly, and he was familiar with at least some of it at the time, if not all of it. I don't know what languages Donnelly read. The inequality on the human race is probably surely translated by then. If Josiah Knott was having it translated, it would have been available in English. Maybe not the other parts, which again, I'm going to get into those. Those should be interesting. Anyway, the stuff was there. Donnelly wasn't an idiot. This video is just to kind of set the table for trying to get more into what he was saying about the role of Aryans in Atlantis and, you know, race in Atlantis. And that stuff is coming next, but I wanted to get this one out of the way. So thank you for watching, and back to your break, and hopefully do something more fun with your time than study the origins of Aryanism. Bye-bye.